A man sits down at a wooden desk in a Kansas prison. It is the 4th of May, 1903. He is given his name, Will West, and he is waiting, the way every new arrival waits, to be turned into a record. The clerk across from him does something strange. He stops. He looks at Will's face a little too long. Then he stands, walks to a wall of filing cards, and comes back with one already filled out. On that card is a photograph. It is Will's face. The measurements written beside it are, to the fraction, Will's measurements. And the name across the top is not new. The man on the card is already here. He is already serving a life sentence inside these same walls. Will West looks at the card and says he has never been to this prison in his life. Hold on to two things while we go back. The first, how can a complete, detailed identity record exist for a man who swears he has never been measured here before? And the second, quieter one. The man who took both of those records, who stood in the room for the whole impossible moment, would go on to write about the history of criminal identification more than once, and would never, not a single time, mention what happened at that desk. Keep both of those in your mind. We'll come back to them. For about 20 years, across 3 continents, that card was the closest thing the world had to certainty about who a person truly was. And to understand why it terrified the men who saw it fail, you first have to understand why anyone believed in it at all. The record shows it began with a clerk in Paris. His name was Alphonse Bertillon, and in the early 1880s, he took the most tedious job a police department had to offer, copying the descriptions of arrested men onto small cards, one after another, day after day. And as he copied, he noticed something that would drive a certain kind of mind to distraction. The descriptions were useless. Tall, dark hair, medium build. A man arrested under one name in the spring could walk back in under another name in the autumn, and no one could prove he was the same person. There was no way to hold a history to a body. So Bertillon decided to fix the body in numbers. Not a description, a measurement. He built a system around 11 precise dimensions of the human frame. The length of the head, the width of the head, the length of the left middle finger, the left foot, the forearm from elbow to fingertip, the reach of the outstretched arms, the height sitting, the height standing, each one taken with specially made calipers by trained hands in a fixed order so that 2 officers measuring the same man would write down the same result. To these he added eye color, hair color, the map of scars and tattoos, and the photograph, taken from the front and the side, in a standard he invented and which we still use today. We still call it the mug shot. The idea underneath it was almost philosophical. Any one of those measurements might be shared by thousands of people, but stack all 11 together, and the combination was supposed to belong to exactly one human being alive. By some accounts, Bertillon put the odds of 2 people sharing all 11 at something on the order of 1 in 4 million. A figure that has been repeated for a century, though no one has ever tied it cleanly to his own papers. Either way, the promise was the same. For the first time, identity was not a matter of memory or a witness's word. It was arithmetic, and it worked. Paris adopted the system in the early 1880s, and within a couple of years it was credited with picking out hundreds of repeat offenders who had tried to hide behind false names, more than 200 in a single year. That kind of result travels fast. The method that carried Bertillon's name, bertillonage, spread out of France and into police forces across Britain, across Europe, and across the Americas. If you were arrested in much of the Western world at the turn of the century, you did not simply give your name. You were measured. You were converted, limb by limb, into a formula on a card, filed away in a vast cross-index cabinet, waiting to catch you if you ever came back. But that certainty was only the surface, because the whole system rested on a single promise, that the 11 numbers were unique. And in a records office in Leavenworth, Kansas, that promise walked in and sat down twice. Go back to the desk. The clerk's name was M. W. McClotry, and he was not a careless man. When Will West gave his name, McClotry did what the system trained him to do. He took Will's 11 measurements. He went to the file, and the file handed back a card that already matched. A man named William West received almost 2 years earlier on the 9th of September, 1901, and sentenced to life for murder. The photographs looked like the same face. The measurements lined up almost perfectly. By every rule of the system, This was a solved case. This was a recidivist caught in a lie, pretending he had never been here. The police had seen it 100 times. Except this time, the William West on the old card was not out in the world under a false name. He was upstairs. He was in his cell. When they brought him down, two men stood in the same room who looked, to everyone present, like the same man, and were not the same man. They were not, as far as the intake officers could tell, related at all. Two separate human beings, unaware of each other, had produced 11 matching numbers. The promise of uniqueness had failed inside a single prison, on a single afternoon. That is the story as it is told. It's in textbooks. It's in FBI materials. It is repeated as the clean, thunderclap moment when the old system died and a new one was born. And the outline of it is true. What is not so simple, and here is where the record begins to resist the legend, is almost everything about what that moment actually meant. Start with the measurements themselves. The two Wests were said to be identical down to the millimeter. But researchers who later went back into the case argue they were not. The record, read closely, shows a difference of roughly 7 millimeters in the length of the two men's feet, a gap larger than the tolerance Bertillon's own rigorous method was supposed to allow. If that reading is right, then the system did not actually fail that day. The men reading the system failed. The numbers were different enough to tell the two men apart, and the clerks, expecting a match, seeing two similar faces, waved the difference through as close enough. The cabinet was not wrong. The hands were, and there is a second crack in the legend, quieter and stranger. The story depends on the two Wests being complete strangers, because a coincidence between strangers is a miracle, while a resemblance between relatives is just biology. But when researchers went back into the prison's own paperwork, what they found does not sit comfortably with a miracle. The two men appear to have corresponded with the same family members. Another inmate reportedly said he had known them both before prison, and that they were brothers, twins. No birth record has ever confirmed it, but the record leans toward them being related. And if they were, then the great one-in-a-million collision was not a collision of strangers at all. It was two brothers separated, arriving at the same fate, carrying nearly the same body. Astonishing still, but not the thing the legend needs it to be. So the miracle shrinks, and the more you press on the story, the more it keeps shrinking, until you reach the strangest part of all, which is what supposedly happened next. In the popular telling, the warden of Leavenworth looked at the two identical men, understood that his entire system had just been exposed, and declared that this was the death of the Bertillon system. And the very next day ordered it replaced with fingerprints. It is a perfect ending, a single sentence, a single decision, a system killed overnight by the weight of its own impossible failure. But look at the timeline the documents actually give you, and the perfect ending falls apart. The switch to fingerprinting at Leavenworth did not happen the next morning. It happened more than a year later, and it did not come from the West case at all. It came from a train and a fair. In 1904, at the World's Fair in St. Louis, the records clerk, the same M. W. McClawtrey who had stood at that desk, met a sergeant from Scotland Yard named John Ferrier, who had come to guard the touring British Crown jewels and who carried with him the fingerprint classification system already in use in England. That is where the American prison learned the method. That autumn, the warden formally wrote to request permission to install it. The change was deliberate, administrative, slow. It arrived by handshake at an exhibition, not by revelation at an intake desk. Which brings us back to the second thing I asked you to hold on to. The clerk who processed both Wests, who took their measurements and, 2 years later, their fingerprints, who was physically present for the one moment the whole legend is built on. He wrote about the history of fingerprinting in America. More than once. And in what survives of that writing, he never mentions the two Wests. Not as a turning point. Not as a curiosity. Not at all. The man best placed to tell us the story we now tell each other apparently did not think it was worth telling. Neither did the other early writers who would have had every reason to seize on it. That is the pattern hiding underneath this whole thing. Sit with it, because it is the actual shape of what happened. A system was built to remove the human being from the act of identification, to replace the mistaken witness, the lying name, the fallible officer, with cold, uniform arithmetic. 11 numbers, no opinion. And when that system stumbled, it did not stumble because the arithmetic broke. It stumbled because human beings still had to hold the calipers, still had to read the cards, still had to decide what a similar face meant. The certainty was never really in the numbers. It was in the people who trusted them. And when a newer, simpler method arrived, one where an unskilled clerk could roll 10 fingers onto a card in a minute and mail it to a central office, the messy, human truth of how the old system actually ended was too complicated to survive. It got smooth. A slow administrative shift became a single dramatic afternoon. Two possibly related men became total strangers. A 7mm difference disappeared. A quiet decision at a fair became a warden's thunderclap. The story that survived was the one that was easiest to tell. The clean one, with a clear villain and a clear hero and a clear moment of death. We should be honest that some of this is still argued over. Historians do not all agree on how large a role the West case truly played, and some of the sharpest counter-readings rest on reconstructions rather than a single clean document. That part deserves the same skepticism we're applying to the legend. But the direction of the evidence is hard to ignore. The famous version is simply too clean for the record it claims to come from. Which leaves us where we started. A man at a desk in the spring of 1903, staring at a card that carries his own face and another man's name, insisting he has never been here before. In the legend, that moment is the end of an era, the instant the machine of measurement finally failed. But if you follow the paper instead of the story, the moment becomes something smaller and somehow heavier. Not the day a system broke. The day two men who may have shared a mother and very nearly shared a set of numbers revealed how much faith an entire civilization had placed in 11 measurements, and how quickly that faith would rewrite its own history to protect itself. Will West served his sentence, and when it ended, he walked out of Leavenworth and left almost no trace behind. The record loses him. We do not really know what became of the man whose face launched a legend he may never have understood he was part of. He gave his 11 numbers, sat for his photograph, and stepped back out into a century that would go on measuring people in new ways, with new promises of certainty, each one insisting, the way the last one had, that this time the arithmetic could not be wrong.